The bank sent a man in a gray suit to walk the property with a clipboard 3 weeks before the auction date, and neither he nor anyone else standing in that frostbitten field had the faintest idea that a half-starved dog sniffing along an old fence row was about to unearth the one piece of paper that could bring the whole foreclosure crashing down. Before any of that, though, there was just a man losing everything slow, one certified letter at a time. Grady Holt was 39 years old and felt every year of it doubled, the way men do when their bodies have been asked to do things bodies were never built for. He'd spent 11 years in the Army, 6 of those with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and he'd come home from his last deployment with a lower back that had been rebuilt around 2 crushed vertebrae, a right knee that clicked like a rusted gate hinge, and a habit of waking at 3 a.m. with his heart going like a jackhammer for no reason he could ever explain to anyone who hadn't been where he'd been. The Army had discharged him with a disability rating that covered maybe a third of what his medical bills actually cost, and a thank you that had felt, in the moment, sincere enough, and had felt, every month since, thinner and thinner as the bills kept coming, and the rating board kept finding new reasons to deny the appeals. He'd come back to the only thing that had ever felt like solid ground under him: his father's farm outside Broken Bow, Nebraska, 240 acres of wheat and soybean ground that had been in the Holt family for 3 generations, a low white farmhouse with a porch that sagged on the north end, and a set of outbuildings his grandfather had built with his own hands back before the war, the other war, the one old enough that nobody living remembered it firsthand. His father had died of a heart attack out in the machine shed the year before Grady's last deployment, and his mother had gone into an assisted living facility 2 years after that, her mind slipping sideways in ways that made the farmhouse too big and too empty and too dangerous for her to stay in alone. Grady had come home from the Army to a mortgage he hadn't known his father had taken out in his last hard years, medical bills of his own stacking on top of it, and a farm economy that had turned mean and unpredictable in exactly the years he needed it to be kind. He lived alone in the farmhouse those days, eating out-of-cans more often than he'd admit to anyone, because cooking for one felt like a chore not worth the effort most nights, and he heated only the kitchen and his bedroom through the worst of the winter to save on the propane bill. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation until they wore through at the elbows. His knee and his back meant he couldn't work the ground the way his father once had, couldn't put in the hours a 240-acre operation actually demanded, and so he'd leased out most of the tillable acres to a neighboring operation for a fraction of what they were worth, just to keep some money coming in, and watched his own family's ground get worked by somebody else's hired hands while he sat on the porch and felt the particular grinding shame of a man who can no longer do the one thing he was raised to do. The betrayal, when it came, arrived not in a single dramatic blow, but in the bureaucratic drip that Grady had come to recognize as the specific cruelty of institutions. A loan modification he'd applied for after a bad drought year got lost in paperwork twice by 2 different loan officers at Prairie Trust Bank, the regional bank that held his father's original mortgage. A hardship deferment he'd been verbally promised over the phone never got entered into any system anyone could find a record of. A letter arrived in March informing him the loan was in default, followed by a notice of intent to foreclose, followed by a court date, followed 4 months after that by a sheriff's sale notice with an actual auction date printed on it in bold black type, the 2nd Tuesday of June on the courthouse steps in Custer County, his family's farm to go to the highest bidder. The house itself had become a kind of map of everything he'd lost and everything he was trying to hold on to at the same time. His mother's kitchen curtains still hung in the windows, faded now from years of sun, and he hadn't been able to bring himself to take them down even though the pattern on them, small yellow sunflowers, cheerful in a way that felt almost cruel against the gray weight of the last 2 years, had nothing left in it that matched the man he'd become. His father's boots still stood by the mudroom door where he'd left them the last morning of his life, and Grady stepped around them every single day rather than move them, telling himself it was practical, that he might need the extra pair someday, knowing all the while it was something closer to superstition, a refusal to admit that a threshold LD could ever be entirely crossed. He ate standing up most nights, canned soup or beans warmed on the stove, because sitting at the kitchen table alone with his father's chair empty across from him felt like a weight he didn't have the strength to carry on top of everything else. He'd stopped answering the phone unless he recognized the number, because too many of the calls that came in those months were either the bank or a collections agency working on the bank's behalf, both of them using the same flat, scripted patience that Grady had come to find more exhausting than open hostility would have been. He kept a legal pad by the phone with every call logged, date, time, name of whoever he'd spoken to, exactly what they'd promised, because he'd learned early on that promises made over the phone by bank employees had an uncanny tendency to evaporate the moment he needed them to be real, and a man with nothing else left to protect himself with could at least keep a record. His knee ached worse in the cold, and the cold came early and stayed late on that stretch of the Nebraska plains, so that by November most years he was already moving like a man 20 years older than his age, and by March, when the trouble with the bank had stretched past a year with no resolution in sight, he'd started rationing his pain medication, not because the VA had cut him off, though they eventually would over a paperwork dispute of their own, but because he'd started needing the money it cost more than he needed the relief it gave, a calculation that told him plainly how far he'd fallen from the young ranger who'd once thought no obstacle in the world could outlast him. He'd fought it the only way a man with no lawyer and no money for one could fight it, showing up to every hearing, filing every form the clerk of court would help him understand, calling the bank's customer service line so many times he'd memorized the hold music, and every time the wall in front of him held. Prairie Trust's paperwork said the loan was in default. Prairie Trust's paperwork said all the proper notices had been sent. Prairie Trust's lawyer, a smooth, unhurried man named Casewell, told the judge each time with a straight face that the bank had worked extensively with Mr. Holt to find alternatives, and the judge, overworked and unfamiliar with the specific slow violence of a paperwork error compounding over 18 months, had no particular reason to disbelieve him. That was where things stood, that cold morning in late April, when Grady was out checking a stretch of collapsed fence along the northern boundary of the property, land he still walked every day out of habit, even knowing it wouldn't be his to walk much longer, and found a dog standing in the middle of the old two-track lane, not moving, not approaching, just watching him with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up before he'd even gotten close enough to see the animal clearly. It was a big dog, mixed breed by the look of it, some kind of shepherd cross with a barrel chest, and a coat the color of dry wheat stubble, filthy and matted, one back leg held slightly off the ground in a permanent, careful favor that told Grady the injury underneath it was old and had healed wrong. There was a puckered scar running along the dog's left shoulder, hairless and shiny, the unmistakable shape of an old surgical repair rather than a simple wound. The dog didn't run from him and didn't approach. It simply stood, weight settled low, watching him come with an attention that Grady, 11 years a soldier, recognized immediately as a working animal's assessment rather than a stray's fear. "You lost," Grady said, stopping 10 feet off, hands loose at his sides. The dog's ears flicked toward his voice, and then, without any further ceremony, it lay down flat in the mud of the two-track, chin on its front paws, and simply watched him, patient as stone. Grady stood there a long moment in the cold spring wind, feeling something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, and then he crouched down, slow, favoring his knee, and held a hand out low the way you do. "All right," he said. "Come on then, can't leave you out here." It took him 20 minutes of patient coaxing, and the last of a beef jerky stick from his coat pocket to get the dog to follow him back toward the house, at a wary 6-foot distance that reminded Grady, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, of the distance new privates kept from a squad leader they hadn't yet learned to trust. He didn't name it right away. He told himself this was because he had a foreclosure auction bearing down on him, and no business taking on the responsibility of a dog he might not even have a house to keep it in past June, though the truer reason, which he didn't examine too closely, was that he'd learned the hard way that things a man let himself love had a way of being taken from him, and he had precisely no appetite left for another low SS on top of the one already coming. He fed the dog in the mudroom off a chipped bowl, and it ate in a fast, silent, joyless way that told him plainly the animal had been hungry for a good long while. It didn't bark. In the first week, Grady realized it hadn't made a single sound at all beyond the click of its claws on the linoleum and the occasional low huff of breath, moving through the house and the yard with a discipline and quiet that felt more and more like something trained into it rather than simply temperament. He took it to the vet in town, a soft-spoken older man named Dr. Reinhold, who doctored Grady's father's cattle dogs for 30 years, mostly because the animal had a raw patch on its neck that needed looking at, and it was there, running a scanner wand over the dog's shoulders out of routine practice, that Dr. Reinhold found the microchip. Well, I'll be, the vet said, squinting at the little handheld reader. This is a military chip registration format. I've seen maybe 2 of these in 30 years of practice. Dog's got a service history, son. The number the scanner produced led, after 2 phone calls and a wait on hold that Grady spent standing in the vet's parking lot with his free hand resting on the dog's head, to a nonprofit organization out of Texas that specialized in tracking and helping place retired contract and military working dogs. An organization run, as it happened, by a woman named Sheila Voss who had once, 20 years back, served as a K-9 handler herself, and who now spent her retirement trying to make sure dogs like this one didn't just vanish into the cracks of an indifferent system. "Give me the chip number again," she said, and Grady heard keys clicking on the other end of the line. There was a pause and then a small, sharp intake of breath. "You're kidding me. That's Ranger." "That's a hell of a coincidence," Grady said, feeling something cold and strange move through him. "I was 75th Ranger Regiment myself." "No coincidence, actually. Well, maybe a small one," Sheila said. "That dog's registered name was Diesel, but before that he came up through an Army breeding and training program and was attached for about 4 years to an EOD unit working route clearance in Kandahar and Helmand provinces, 010 through 014 or so. Explosive detection specifically. He wasn't just sniffing for bombs, son. He was trained to alert on buried ordnance, pressure plates, anything hidden under disturbed ground. Best nose in his class, according to the notes I've got here. There's an incident logged in 2012, a route clearance patrol outside Sangin, where he alerted on a pressure plate IED buried 18 inches down under a stretch of road that looked completely undisturbed to the naked eye, saved an entire convoy. Took some shrapnel to the shoulder in a separate incident the following year when a secondary device went off during a clearance operation, which is likely what did the damage to that leg you're describing. Grady looked down at the dog, who was lying at his feet in the gravel lot, chin on paws, watching him with a stillness that suddenly felt entirely different than it had 10 minutes earlier. "What happened to him after that?" "Same thing that happens to too many of them," Sheila said, and her voice had gone tired in the particular way of someone who'd fought this exact fight many times before. "Contract handling companies rotate out, funding dries up, and dogs that aren't formally adopted through the DoD pipeline sometimes just get quietly surrendered or sold off to whoever's willing to take them. Records be damned. Diesel's file goes cold about 3 years back. Last entry says he was transferred to private care, which in my experience usually means somebody decided a scarred up, aging detection dog wasn't worth the trouble anymore and passed him along to whoever would take him off their hands. However, he ended up in a ditch in Nebraska, Mr. Holt. I promise you nobody planned for that to happen. That dog earned better than that." "He's not getting anything less than better, starting now," Grady said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised him, given that 2 weeks earlier he hadn't been sure he had that kind of conviction left in him for anything. He renamed him that same evening, sitting on the porch steps in the cooling dusk. Diesel felt like somebody else's name, a name given by people who'd used him up and passed him along. Grady tried out a few names in his head and settled, without quite knowing why, on Scout, a name that felt less like ownership and more like a shared job description, the two of them out here scouting a way forward together, whatever the next few weeks were going to bring. "Scout," he said out loud, testing it. The dog's ears swiveled at the sound, and something in the animal's posture eased a fraction, weight settling deeper into the porch boards beside him. "Yeah," Grady said, "that fits." What followed? Over the weeks between that afternoon and the auction date bearing down on the calendar like a slow freight train, was the quiet, unglamorous work of 2 damaged creatures learning to trust each other, built out of 100 small moments rather than one large one. Scout slept in the mudroom the first 2 weeks, on an old moving blanket Grady had thrown down more or less without thinking about it, and it was another 10 days before the dog would take food directly from Grady's hand instead of only from the bowl on the ground, and it was nearly a month before Scout made any sound beyond breathing, and when he finally did, it wasn't a bark at all, but a low, rising whine, almost musical, 3 notes climbing and falling. That Grady came to understand was the dog's singular way of asking for something, whether that something was the door opened, the water bowl refilled, or simply Grady's attention when he'd been staring too long and too silently out at the fields he was about to lose. "I hear you," Grady would say, every time, and it became a kind of call and response between them that Grady found himself looking forward to more than he expected. There was a morning, maybe 3 weeks in, when Grady's back seized up hauling a bag of dog food out of the truck bed. A spasm so total it dropped him to his knees in the gravel drive with his vision going white at the edges. And Scout crossed the yard faster than Grady had yet seen him move, despite the bad leg, and simply lay down across Grady's lower back and hips, a warm, solid, unmoving weight, until the spasm eased enough for Grady to breathe normal again. "How do you know how to do that?" Grady said into the dirt when he could talk, and thought about what Sheila Voss had told him about deep pressure and grounding work sometimes layered quietly into a detection dog's broader training, alongside the explosive sniffing itself, because a dog that could sense a handler's body breaking down under stress was a dog that could also, in its own limited way, help hold that handler together. Whatever the reason, Grady stopped questioning it after that morning and simply let himself be grateful for it. The wound care became its own ritual, same as the vet had shown him. The raw patch on Scout's neck needed regular cleaning and a protective salve, and the first several times Grady tried it alone, the dog went rigid the instant the cloth touched the spot. A full-body flinch that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with some old, buried memory of a different hand doing something far less gentle. Grady learned to slow everything down when he saw that flinch coming, dropping his voice to the low, even register he'd once used to talk frightened young soldiers through their first firefight, narrating each small movement before he made it, until the rigidity eased out of the dog's body one slow degree at a time. "Nobody's hurting you here," he said, the same words nearly every time, because he'd learned that Scout responded less to the specific words than to the steadiness underneath them, the proof, repeated often enough, that this particular voice could be trusted not to bring pain. There were lighter moments woven through the hard ones, and Grady found himself grateful for every single one, the way a man starved of small joys learns to notice them properly for the first time. Scout developed an intense and inexplicable dislike of the automatic sprinkler that watered Grady's small vegetable garden, retreating to the porch the instant it clicked on and glaring at it from a safe distance, with an offended dignity that made Grady laugh out loud more than once, alone in the yard, the sound strange and unfamiliar in his own ears after so many quiet months. Scout also, Grady discovered, had a habit of positioning himself precisely between Grady and any closed door in the house, never quite blocking it, but always present at the threshold, as though some old training had wired into him a need to clear a room's exits before anyone else moved through them, a habit Grady recognized in himself immediately, since he did the exact same thing unconsciously in restaurants and waiting rooms and anywhere else with more than one way in or out. "We're a matched set, you and me," Grady told him one evening, scratching behind Scout's ears while the dog leaned his full weight into it, eyes half closed. "Both of us checking the exits before we can relax." Spring wore on, cold mornings giving way slowly to warmer ones, and the shape of Grady's days rearranged itself around the dog in ways he hadn't planned and didn't fully notice happening until they'd already happened. He woke most mornings now to the soft click of Scout's claws on the floorboards outside his bedroom door, a patient waiting that never once tried to hurry him, and he found himself, more mornings than not, talking out loud to the dog over his coffee, the way he hadn't talked out loud to anyone in longer than he cared to. Add up narrating the day's chores, his half-formed worries about the auction, memories of his father moving through these same fields with a patience Grady had never fully appreciated until he was the one trying, and failing, to hold onto the ground his father had left him. Not every day was gentle. There were mornings Scout woke stiff and low, that old leg refusing to bear weight properly until well past noon, and on those days Grady learned to slow the whole farm down around him. No long walks, no unnecessary strain, just the two of them sitting together on the porch through the cold hours, until whatever had settled into the dog's bones eased enough to let him move again. "You don't owe me anything today," Grady told him more than once on those slow mornings. "Believe me, I understand a body that won't cooperate, will just sit here till it passes." He learned, gradually, the small vocabulary Scout had built for himself in whatever years had passed since his service ended, the low three-note whine that meant a request, rising in pitch the longer it went unanswered, a single sharp huff of breath that Grady came to recognize as pure, uncomplicated pleasure, usually triggered by the smell of bacon or the first truly warm afternoon after a cold stretch. And a longer, quieter sigh, almost human in its weariness, that seemed reserved for the evenings when the pressure dropped ahead of a storm, the dog seeming to feel the coming weather in his bones hours before the radio ever mentioned it. The storms themselves proved to be the hardest test of that whole stretch of spring. A violent line of weather rolled through in early May, thunder cracking low and constant across the flat country, and the moment it started, Scout came apart in a way Grady hadn't seen from him yet, bolting for the darkest corner of the mudroom, wedging himself behind the water heater hard enough to scrape hide from his shoulder, breath coming in short, ragged bursts that had nothing to do with the temperature. Grady recognized the shape of it instantly, because he'd lived a version of it himself more nights than he liked to count. Not simple noise fear, but a body reliving something the mind had tried hard to bury, thunder standing in for a detonation, the way it so often did for men and dogs who'd lived through the real thing. He didn't try to coax him out fast. He lowered himself down onto the mudroom floor beside the water heater, slow, favoring his own bad knee, and sat there in the dark saying nothing at all for a long while, just breathing slow and even and audible, letting his own steadiness become something Scout's nervous system could borrow from at its own pace. "I know exactly what that sounds like to you," he said, finally quiet, when the shaking hadn't stopped but had at least stopped getting worse. "Doesn't matter that it's just weather. Body doesn't know the difference. Never has, not for me either." He held one hand out, palm up, close but not touching, and left it there, patient. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll just sit here and let it pass together." It took the better part of an hour before Scout's breathing evened out enough that he crept, trembling still, out from behind the water heater and pressed his full weight against Grady's side, and Grady sat with him through the rest of the storm, one hand steady on the dog's heaving ribs, feeling with a clarity that surprised him that he had never in his life felt quite so understood by another living thing, nor so certain the understanding ran both directions. After that night, something between them settled differently. It was as though each of them, having witnessed the other's rawest unguarded moment, no longer had anything left to hide, and whatever wariness had lingered through the gentler weeks before simply burned itself out in that one long, thundering hour on the mudroom floor. There were lighter days, too, threaded through the harder ones, and Grady came to treasure them all the more for how unremarkable they would have looked to anyone watching from outside. Scout developed a fierce, wholly inexplicable rivalry with the garden's automatic sprinkler, retreating to the porch the moment it clicked on and glaring at it from a safe distance with an offended dignity that made Grady laugh out loud, alone in the yard, a sound strange and unfamiliar in his own ears after so many quiet months of just enduring. Scout also took to positioning himself, without fail, at the threshold of any closed door in the house, never quite blocking it but always present, as if some old training had wired into him the need to clear a room's exits before anyone moved through them, a habit Grady recognized immediately, since he did the same thing himself, unconsciously, in waiting rooms and diners and anywhere else with more than one way in or out. "We're a matched set, you and me," Grady told him one evening, scratching behind Scout's ears while the dog leaned his whole weight into it. Yes, half closed in the fading light, both of us checking the exits before we can let ourselves rest. The wound care became its own quiet ritual across those weeks, the raw patch on Scout's neck needing regular cleaning and salve, and the first several times Grady tried it alone, the dog went rigid the instant the cloth touched the spot, a full-body flinch with nothing to do with present pain and everything to do with some old, buried memory of a rougher hand. Grady learned to slow everything down when he felt that flinch coming, narrating each small movement in a low, even voice before he made it, the same register he'd once used to talk frightened young soldiers through their worst nights, until the rigidity eased out of the dog's body one slow degree at a time, and that single wary eye came to rest, trusting on his face. "Nobody's hurting you here," he said, the same words nearly every time, because he'd come to understand that Scout responded less to the specific words than to the steadiness underneath them, proof, repeated often enough, that this particular voice could be trusted. The auction date loomed closer through all of this, an ugly fact that never quite left the corner of Grady's mind even in the gentlest moments with the dog. Casewell, the bank's lawyer, sent one final letter in early May confirming the sale would proceed as scheduled, offering, with the same smooth, unhurried tone he used in the courtroom, a small relocation assistance payment if Grady vacated the property voluntarily before the sheriff's sale rather than forcing an eviction. Grady read the letter twice at the kitchen table, Scout's head resting heavy on his boot beneath it, and felt something in him go cold and still in a way he hadn't felt since certain nights overseas, not despair exactly, but a hard, clarifying anger that told him he wasn't done fighting yet, even if he couldn't yet see the shape of the fight ahead. It was 2 weeks before the auction, on a gray, drizzling afternoon, when the gray-suited bank appraiser came out to walk the property one final time ahead of the sale. A young man named Petrick, who did the job with the brisk, apologetic efficiency of someone who knew exactly how unwelcome he was and wanted to be gone as fast as possible. Grady walked the property line with him out of some grim sense of obligation, Scout trailing a few yards behind, and it was in the old orchard at the northeast corner of the property. 6 gnarled apple trees Grady's grandfather had planted decades back, long past bearing much fruit but still standing. A stubborn little grove nobody had ever gotten around to clearing. That Scout suddenly went rigid. Grady had seen that stillness before, in the 2-track lane the day he found him, but this was different, sharper. Every muscle in the dog's body locked tight, nose down, working the ground in short, precise arcs the way a man works a metal detector, moving in a tightening spiral toward one particular spot beneath the oldest of the 6 trees. Then, without any bark, without any sound at all beyond a low, urgent whine, Scout began to dig, fast, focused, front paws throwing dirt in a steady rhythm. The exact posture Sheila Voss had described to him weeks before when she talked about how the dog had been trained to alert on buried objects hidden under disturbed ground. "Whoa, hold up, what's he got?" Petrick said, alarmed, stepping back. "Give him a minute," Grady said, and something in his own voice had gone flat and focused in a way he recognized from another life entirely. 2 feet down, Scout's paws struck something hard and hollow-sounding, and Grady got down on his own knees in the wet dirt beside the dog and finished the job by hand, working carefully around the object rather than through it, old habits from another kind of digging entirely asserting themselves without him even deciding to let them. What came up wrapped in a rotted scrap of oilcloth inside a rusted metal ammunition tin that Grady recognized immediately as Army surplus, likely his grandfather's from his own service decades back, was a thick, water-stained bundle of papers, brittle at the edges but legible, that Grady spread carefully on the tailgate of his truck while Petrick hovered, forgotten, at the edge of the orchard. It took him the better part of that evening, and several careful, cautious weeks after, working with a legal aid attorney he found through a veterans assistance hotline, to understand exactly what he was looking at and what it meant. The papers were his grandfather's original loan and land documents from the 1960s, along with a set of correspondence and a handwritten ledger that told a story nobody living had known to tell. Decades earlier, in a dispute over water rights and a boundary survey with a neighboring landowner, a loan officer at the very same bank, then called First Custer Trust, later absorbed into what was now Prairie Trust, had altered the recorded acreage and mineral rights on the Holt family's original deed without the family's full knowledge, in a scheme designed to quietly shift a strip of valuable land and the mineral rights beneath it to a business partner of the bank's own president at the time. Grady's grandfather had apparently discovered the fraud, confronted the bank privately rather than risk a costly legal fight he couldn't afford, extracted an informal, undocumented promise that the altered acreage would eventually be corrected, and then, distrustful of the bank's paper trail after what he'd found, had buried his own copy of the original, unaltered deed and loan documents, the ammunition tin his own service in an earlier war had left him. As insurance against the day the bank might try something like it again. That day, it turned out, had finally come, 60 years later, in the form of Grady's own foreclosure. Working with his legal aid attorney, a sharp, patient young woman named Marisol Chen, who took the case pro bono the moment she understood what the buried documents implied, Grady discovered that the current default and foreclosure proceeding rested on a mortgage balance and an acreage figure that Prairie Trust's own modern records, when properly compared against the buried original deed, did not actually match the bank's foreclosure paperwork. Prepared in haste by an overloaded loan servicing department, had inherited and compounded the same 6-decade-old acreage discrepancy his grandfather had uncovered, along with a set of far more recent irregularities that Marisol's further digging revealed once they knew where to look. 2 separate hardship deferment applications that bank records showed as never received, despite postal tracking numbers proving they'd been delivered and signed for. And a pattern when Marisol pulled foreclosure filings from the county recorder's office going back 3 years, of no fewer than 5 other family farms in the immediate area foreclosed on by Prairie Trust under similarly rushed, error-riddled paperwork, all 5 of them, once resold at auction, ending up in the hands of the same shell development company. One quietly tied through a chain of ownership filings to a regional highway expansion project that stood to make whoever controlled that stretch of land a great deal of money once the new route was finalized. "This isn't just sloppy paperwork," Marisol told Grady, laying it all out across his kitchen table one evening in late May, papers fanned out in careful stacks, Scout lying watchful at Grady's feet. "This is a pattern. Somebody inside that bank, or somebody working closely with it, has been engineering defaults on properties that happen to sit along a proposed highway corridor, using errors just plausible enough to survive a quick look, banking on the fact that most of the families losing these farms don't have the resources to fight back properly. Your grandfather's buried deed doesn't just save your farm, Grady. It's the first solid piece of physical evidence tying the current fraud back 60 years, which makes the whole pattern a lot harder for a judge to write off as coincidence." The work of building the case took longer than Grady expected, and it demanded a kind of patience he found, somewhat to his own surprise, he still had in him. Marisol needed certified copies of decades-old county recorder filings, and Grady spent the better part of 3 days driving to the courthouse in Broken Bow, and a second courthouse 2 counties over, waiting in dim records rooms, while a clerk with arthritic hands pulled dusty microfilm, reels older than Grady himself, Scout waiting patiently in the truck each time with the windows cracked, greeting him at the door with that rising 3-note whine every single time Grady came back out. As though each separate absence had genuinely worried him. At night, after Marisol had gone home and the farmhouse had gone quiet, Grady laid the documents out across the kitchen table under the yellow overhead light and went through them the way he'd once gone through intelligence reports in another life, cross-referencing dates, flagging inconsistencies, building a timeline on a legal pad in handwriting that got steadier the longer he worked at it. Scout lay beneath the table through most of these long nights, chin resting on Grady's boot, occasionally lifting his head to fix that watchful gaze on the window whenever a truck passed on the county road outside, a habit that struck Grady, more than once, as its own quiet form of standing guard while the human half of the operation did the paperwork. It was on one of those late nights, comparing the water rights correspondence against a plat map from 1961, that Grady found the detail that would end up mattering more than anything else in the eventual hearing. A surveyor's notation, easy to miss, showing that the altered acreage boundary didn't just shave land off the Holt family's original deed, it shifted the property line directly across a section that a follow-up geological survey, filed 8 years later and buried in an entirely separate county file Marisol had to request specially, showed contained a modest but real vein of gravel and limestone deposits, the kind of mineral resource that wouldn't have meant much to a struggling wheat farm in the 1960s, but that meant a great deal more to a modern highway construction project that would need exactly that kind of material, locally sourced, to keep costs down. "That's the missing piece," Marisol told him when he brought her the notation, sitting across his kitchen table with her own reading glasses pushed up into her hair. "It answers the question I couldn't answer before, which is why nobody goes to this much trouble engineering a foreclosure over ordinary wheat ground. But shave a chunk of land containing a usable gravel deposit off a family's deed, 60 years back, and then decades later foreclose on the same family under confused, error-riddled paperwork that still reflects the old, altered boundary. And suddenly the shell development company associated with the highway project gets exactly the material rights it needs, quietly, without ever having to negotiate an honest price for them." Grady sat with that a long moment, one hand resting on Scout's head where the dog had settled beside his chair. "My grandfather buried that tin knot because he was paranoid," he said slowly. "He buried it because he already knew, 60 years ago, that a bank willing to cheat a farmer once would be willing to try it again, given enough time and a long enough memory. He just didn't figure it'd be his own grandson standing here having to dig it back up." "Some debts take a long time to come due," Marisol said, "but they do come due, eventually. That's usually when the people who created them have long since assumed nobody's left who remembers to collect." The confrontation, when it came, arrived not as a gunfight but as a courtroom, and Grady would say afterward that the calm, methodical work of the weeks beforehand, walking the property lines with Scout at his side each evening, while he and Marisol built their case fact by fact, the same patient, unhurried gathering of intelligence he'd once brought to a decade of overseas operations, had mattered more than any single dramatic moment could have. But there was one tense evening, 4 days before the scheduled auction, when a car Grady didn't recognize idled twice past the farmhouse after dark, slow enough to be casing the place, and Scout stood rigid at the window each time, that same silent, fixed alert holding steady until the car finally didn't come back a third time. Grady never did learn for certain who'd been in it, though Marisol's private theory, delivered carefully and without accusation she couldn't prove, was that someone connected to the scheme had gotten wind of what the buried documents showed and wanted to know exactly how much trouble was coming their way. 2 nights after that, a second, more concrete incident settled the question of how seriously the other side was taking the threat Grady now posed. He woke a little after midnight to Scout standing rigid at the foot of the bed, that same silent alert fixed on the bedroom door. No bark, no whine, just an intensity that had Grady's feet on the floor, and his old service pistol in hand before his conscious mind had finished catching up to what his body already understood. He moved through the dark house the way 11 years of training had built into muscle and bone, low, quiet checking corners before he committed to them. Scout pressed silent against his leg the whole way, until he reached the mudroom and found the back door standing open 2 inches, the old lock strike plate pried loose and hanging by a single screw, someone having gotten that far and then, for whatever reason, thought better of finishing the job. He called it in to the county sheriff's department, who found tire tracks in the soft ground near the machine shed that matched no vehicle registered to Grady or to any of his neighbors. And Marisol, when he told her about it the next morning, went very quiet on the phone for a moment before telling him, in a voice that had lost its usual courtroom calm, that she wanted him to make copies of every document in that ammunition tin that same day and get the originals into a bank safe deposit box under a name other than his own. "Whoever's behind this is getting nervous," she said. "Nervous people make mistakes, which helps us. But nervous people can also get reckless, which is exactly why I want that evidence somewhere they can't reach it, and I want you and that dog staying alert until this is over." Grady didn't need telling twice. He'd spent a decade of his life staying alert for a living, and if anything, the old, familiar clarity of an actual threat, something concrete to prepare for, rather than the slow, faceless grind of foreclosure paperwork, felt almost Ike relief after 18 months of fighting an enemy made of nothing but delay and denial. He and Scout fell, without either of them discussing it, into an old rhythm. A last check of the property line each evening before dark, doors locked and verified twice. The pistol kept close at hand, Scout stationed at whichever window faced the road, and Grady found himself, more than once in those last tense days before the hearing, grateful in a way he hadn't expected to be for a dog whose training meant he never once needed to be told what watching for trouble actually looked like. The hearing itself, held 6 days after the original auction date, thanks to an emergency stay Marisol secured on the strength of the newly discovered evidence, was almost anticlimactic by comparison to the tension that had built toward it. A judge who listened, for once, with real attention as Marisol laid out the 60-year paper trail alongside the recent pattern of similarly rushed foreclosures. Casewell's smooth courtroom composure fraying visibly as the acreage discrepancies were laid side by side on the projector screen, and a loan servicing supervisor from Prairie Trust, called to testify, growing increasingly evasive under cross-examination about the 2 lost hardship applications, until the judge herself interrupted to ask, with open skepticism, how 2 separate applications, sent by 2 different methods, could both simply vanish without a trace inside the bank's own systems. The foreclosure was vacated. The judge, troubled enough by what she'd heard to refer the broader pattern to the state attorney general's office for further investigation, ordered Prairie Trust to correct its records to reflect the original accurate acreage from Grady's grandfather's deed, wipe out the erroneous default entirely, and restructure the loan under terms that finally accounted for the hardship deferment the bank should have honored 18 months earlier. The Attorney General's investigation that followed, over the subsequent months, would eventually implicate a regional vice president at Prairie Trust and 2 outside consultants connected to the highway development scheme, though the details of criminal charges and settlements would take the better part of a year to fully play out. Slower, quieter justice than any courtroom drama, but justice all the same, the kind built out of paperwork and patience rather than confrontation, which suited Grady in the end. Just fine. The weeks after the ruling passed strangely for Grady, in the particular way that relief sometimes takes longer to feel real than the crisis it replaces. He kept waking at his old hour out of habit, kept reaching for the legal pad by the phone before remembering there was nothing left that needed logging, kept walking the property line each evening with Scout at his side out of a vigilance that had become so deeply worn into him that it took the better part of a month before his shoulders finally began, one slow degree at a time, to unclench. Marisol's investigation into the broader pattern moved forward in the background through that summer, methodical and unhurried the way real justice, usually, is rather than the way television makes it look. The state attorney general's office subpoenaed internal emails from Prairie Trust's loan servicing department that, once uncovered, made the scheme's outlines plain even to people who'd never looked at a plat map in their lives. A regional vice president named Corwin, coordinating by email with two outside land consultants about which distressed properties along the highway corridor could be pushed toward foreclosure fastest. Language in the emails so casually cold about families' hardships that Marisol told Grady, reading portions of it to him over the phone, that even she, jaded after years of foreclosure defense work, had felt something turn over in her stomach. Corwin resigned from the bank within a week of the subpoenas becoming public, and would, over the following year, face both civil penalties and a criminal fraud charge that ultimately resulted in a plea deal, restitution, and a sentence that struck some of the affected families as too light for what he'd done, though Grady found, to his own mild surprise, that he had less appetite for the man's punishment than he'd expected. What he wanted in the end wasn't Corwin's ruin. It was simply the ground back under his feet, undisputed, and the knowledge that the next family who found something buried and unexpected under an old apple tree wouldn't have to fight quite as hard as he had to be believed. Prairie Trust, eager to settle quietly and avoid the reputational damage of a fuller public reckoning, offered Grady a settlement figure well beyond what the corrected loan balance alone would have required, money enough, his attorney told him plainly, to pay off the farm free and clear and have a real cushion left besides. Grady took the settlement because he wasn't foolish. Enough to leave money on the table that his family had more than earned the hard way, but when a local news reporter came out to the farm afterward, hoping for a triumphant quote about vindication and victory, Grady found himself talking less about the money and more about the dog sitting patient at his feet through the whole interview. "Everybody wants to make this about beating the bank," he told the reporter, one hand resting on Scout's head, the dog leaning into it with his eyes half closed in the late spring sun. "And I guess we did that. But what I keep coming back to is, I found this dog half-starved on a 2-track road 3 weeks before I was set to lose everything my grandfather built, and it turned out he'd spent years of his life finding things buried underground that could kill people, and here he goes and finds the one thing buried underground that ended up saving me instead. Man does a decade of digging up danger for his country, gets thrown away for his trouble same as I nearly did, and it turns out the last thing left in him to dig up was the answer to the only fight I had left. That's not really a story about a bank when you get down to it. That's a story about not giving up on things, a farm, a dog, either one, before you found out what they're actually worth." He kept farming the ground himself in the years after, hip and knee permitting, hiring on help for the heaviest seasons rather than leasing the whole operation away again, and he kept the old orchard standing exactly as it was, refusing every suggestion from well-meaning neighbors that the 6 gnarled, half-dead apple trees ought to be cleared to make room for something more productive. That ground already produced the one thing that mattered most, he told anyone who asked. "I figure it's earned its retirement, same as him." He'd nod toward Scout, who by then had taken to sleeping most afternoons in the dappled shade beneath that same oldest tree, the one spot on 240 acres he seemed to prefer above all others, as though some old, patient instinct in him understood exactly what he'd once found there and had claimed the spot for his own ever since. On a warm evening that first autumn after the settlement, Grady sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee going lukewarm in his hand, watching the light go long and gold across wheat ground that was, for the first time in 2 years, entirely and unambiguously his own. Scout stretched out beside him with his bad leg tucked carefully underneath, that low 3-note whine rising once soft, when Grady's hand paused too long in its scratching behind his ears. "I hear you," Grady said, resuming the scratching, and the whine settled back into a slow, contented breathing that Grady had come to treasure more than almost any other sound in his life. "We did all right, didn't we? Both of us digging our way out of something, one way or another." Scout, of course, said nothing back, beyond that steady breathing and the warm, solid weight of him leaning into Grady's side. But Grady had learned by then that some of the truest conversations a man ever has don't need any words in them at all, and he sat there a long while in the gathering dark, grateful, quiet, and finally, after 2 very hard years, something close enough to at peace. "If this story moved you, I'd be grateful if you hit that like button before you go," because it genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories of veterans and the dogs who saved them right back. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you catch the next one the moment it goes up. Leave a comment and tell me what part of Grady and Scout's story stayed with you longest. I read every single one of them. And if you know somebody who needs a reminder that what's buried doesn't always stay lost, and that loyalty has a way of paying itself back when you least expect it, please share this with them. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.